Hello, everyone, and welcome to SCORE Fairfield County's live webinar on what to consider when selling a small business. I'm Bob Hogan, the webinar coordinator and a business mentor here at SCORE Fairfield County. I'm going to be your host today, and our presenters are Phil Fitzgerald and Cliff Ennico. More on Phil and Cliff in just a minute, but first some brief information on SCORE. SCORE is a nonprofit national partner of the SBA with over 10,000 volunteers nationally. Locally here at SCORE Fairfield County, we have over 100 volunteers with a wide range of industry process and subject matter expertise. And Phil, if I could just ask you to advance the slide, please. We offer three primary value-added services to small business owners. First is we offer free one-on-one counseling, and you can access that in person, via video, telephone, or email, whatever works best for you. And you can do that by just clicking on the Request a Mentor link on our website or using the yellow bit.ly link that you see here on the screen. Secondly, we offer a wide range of educational workshops and webinars like the one today. We offer them both in person and online webinars that you can take, also access on demand. Lastly, we offer extensive resources, including business tools and information on our website. And we also have a large number of recorded webinars on our website that cover a wide range of business topics. And again, you can view those at any time just by going to on-demand webinars. Just some logistics about today's webinar. We have set aside time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at any time during the presentation. It's located in the lower part of your screen. And our webinar will end sharply at 1 o'clock to respect your time. The session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available on our website, fairfieldcounty.score.org, within the next day or so. It's now my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Phil Fitzgerald. Phil is the founder and principal of Amplify Consulting Services, a boutique advisory firm focused on helping small businesses prepare for M&A transactions. Before founding Amplify in 2021, Phil was an investment banker for over 20 years and has worked for companies of all sizes across a wide range of industries on M&A transactions over the course of his career. He graduated from Cornell University with a BS in Business Management and Marketing. Cliff Ennico is a nationally recognized authority on small business, legal, and tax issues, and is best known as the former host of Money Hunt, the PBS television series for entrepreneurs. He is the author of 16 books, including the Crowdfunding Handbook, How to Raise Capital for Your Small Business or Startup Using Equity Funding Portals. An attorney and a small business consultant based in Fairfield, Connecticut, Cliff has helped launch over 15,000 businesses. I'll now turn it over first to Phil. Phil, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you to you for setting this up and organizing. Thanks to Cliff for allowing me to join him on this conversation, and thanks to everyone in the audience for spending a little time with us today. So why don't we jump right in? There is a lot to cover and a lot of information we're going to share. As Bob mentioned, we're going to try to make sure we save some time at the end for questions and answers, but also if questions come in, we'll try to answer them as they come in if it makes sense. So when we talk about selling a business, why don't we get started with just the very basics? It sounds very simple. You want to sell your business, you go out, you find a buyer, you sell the business, you move on. You go play golf, you sit on the beach, you go fishing, you spend time with your family. All of that awaits you when you sell your business. And let's face it, you've invested time, energy, money, blood, sweat, and tears. You've been successful, but it's time for something new. Or it's time to retire. Maybe it really isn't working out the way you expected or hoped. Or maybe someone's asking if you consider selling. And no matter what the reason is, and yes, we are going to spend a little time on the various reasons you might sell your business. When it comes time, you're going to have a lot to think about. So yes, it sounds simple, but usually it's actually not that simple. In fact, selling a business can take months or even years. And in some cases, and unfortunately, the business may shut before it can even be sold. So what is so difficult about selling a business? Again, it sounds so simple. You've been working in your business for some time. You probably know the operations cold. You certainly know the customers, the trends, the products, the services, the key performance indicators. You could probably run your business with your eyes closed, and hopefully that's the case for a lot of you in the audience. But also for a lot of you, when you decide you're going to sell your business, it's probably going to be the first time and maybe even the only time you ever do this. And there are a lot of things you need to think about before you sell your business, and probably quite a few more than you might expect. So this slide shows a lot of the common concepts that arise when you talk about selling a business, and it's not even comprehensive. These are really only the business terms. We haven't even touched on the legal, accounting, or commercial terms, but you can see there's quite a lot just to think about when you're starting to think about the process. And we're not going to go into all these terms today, so don't worry. There's not going to be a vocabulary test at the end of the conversation. Do feel free to reach out if you want to talk about any of these ideas in detail. Cliff or I are happy to spend some time thinking about this. But in today's session, we're really going to spend some time talking about some of the practical considerations, as well as being in the right mindset and making sure you're thinking about the big picture items that come along with selling the business. So today we're going to start with 5 key things you really need to understand to be ready to sell your business. And these things are fundamental to the process. Thinking about first, is it the right time? Is it the right time for you as the business owner? Is it the right time for the business? Is it the right time in the market? And second, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about valuation. What is your business worth? And I will preview that there is a controversial take on this coming a little bit later in the presentation. I have a bit of a contrarian view on valuation, but hopefully it'll be helpful as you think about how to approach the concept of what is my business worth. Then we're going to spend a little time on thinking about the right buyer. And buyers come in various shapes and sizes. They can be people in your industry, companies that are your competitors or your customers or your partners, or even your suppliers. Or in other cases, they may be friends and family, people that are deeply involved in your personal life that may be of interest. So a lot of family businesses pass the ownership and the control of the business to the children after the founders retire. And then there are financial investors that you might want to think about, private equity or family offices or businesses like that are what I call professional investors. I think the key is thinking about them from having different perspectives, different financial objectives, and different requirements for due diligence, but they all have an ultimate objective of buying a business. After we think about the buyers, we'll spend a few moments on due diligence, because that is kind of probably the most arduous portion of the entire process. And it's one that I think is often where owners are not necessarily prepared for what it's going to mean to go through due diligence. But of course, what's really important, and where I think Cliff will add a lot of value here, is who can help me? This is not a process you need to go through alone. Or as the Stanley Kubrick fans in the room might say, who can help me? Or you need professional help. And luckily, there is professional help out there to get you through the process. So why don't we start at the top with, is now the right time? And I think of this as really having 3 pieces to the question. Again, are you ready? Are you mentally, emotionally, operationally ready? Second, is the business ready? Are there operational improvements that are needed for the business to be attractive to a potential buyer? Are there gaps on the team that might need to be filled in the near term? And then third, is the market receptive? Does it support the price that you want in order to be a willing seller? So we're going to spend a little time on each of these sides. So the first question of, are you ready? For a lot of business owners, the business is their identity. In a lot of cases, you may have been doing it for years or even decades. So it's what you've been doing for a long period of time. So as a business owner, you do need to spend some time thinking about what life looks when you step away from the day-to-day of the business. What are you going to do to fill that time? What will you do next? And hopefully you're already thinking about this. This is, as a business owner myself, it's a personal daydream, what I will do when I no longer have to or want to or need to work. So hopefully you're thinking about how you'll occupy yourself after leaving the business. A lot of businesses are reluctant to sell because they haven't thought about that. So it is important to spend time on this sooner rather than later. The number one priority as you think about exiting the business for a business owner, if you ultimately want to sell your business, in my mind, is to make yourself irrelevant. Yes, you need to get out of your own way. You need to delegate. You need to empower your employees. You need to do what you need to do so that the next owner of the business is not dependent on you to keep coming to work. So buyers, generally speaking, they want to know that the business is being transferred. I can say from experience, when a buyer sees a business where the owner is the key salesperson, the key operational person, the key anything, they can get pretty concerned. a business that depends on any one person or one product or one customer or one anything is generally a business at risk. So when you start to think about how to reduce the business's reliance on you, you'll be looking to find people to take the ownership of the tasks that you've been focusing on. And that's when you'll be really ready to sell. You'll be thinking about what's your succession plan, who will be taking over the role, who will be stepping into your shoes, who can the next owner of the business rely on to drive the business forward in the future. And this process certainly is not one that happens overnight. It can take some time, sometimes years, certainly months at a minimum. So it is important for you to think about this process in the near term. Now, the second piece here on this slide is the business ready. Often as an M&A professional, one of the questions I often think about is, how do you compare this to other situations? And it is very similar to selling a house. Not a terrible analogy. Both processes usually involve a seller who generally knows a lot about the asset for sale. I mean, when you're selling a house, who knows better what's going on in the house than the person actually living in it? You know all the quirks of the plumbing, which door sticks when it gets a little humid, and all the information about the various systems in the house and when they were last serviced. It's probably not terribly different for your business. As the owner, you probably know quite a bit about how it runs and what it needs to be successful. And like selling a house, there are things you can do to improve the business before the sale, but there are also some things that you might not have the time or the energy or the resources to do because you're a little bit more of a motivated seller. So you need to think about the timing and balancing the value of those improvements you might make and who's actually going to benefit from those things. Who is getting the value of the improvements you might make before you sell the business? If it's something that you and the new owner will both benefit from, that might be something you do now. But if it's only going to accrue benefit to the new owner, you might think twice about whether you make that improvement now or let the buyer do it after the deal. So for example, if you're going to replace the head of sales, you might think about what that looks like in terms of their contribution to the business today versus after the sale goes through. So how do you know if your business is ready? How do you understand whether the business is attractive to buyers? Well, I think there's a couple things you generally look at. And the first is the structure of the team. When you think about how the business runs, are there notable gaps that you need to fill in the near term? Or another way of thinking about it, will you be penalized for a key personnel vacancy? In other words, if you don't have a CFO and you need one, should you hire one before a transaction? That is something to consider. You also should spend some time looking at your product and service portfolio. Look at the operations and the operating metrics. Is the business performing as well as it could be? How is your competitive positioning? Can you take steps to improve the business in the time leading up to the sale process? Now, is now the right time from the perspective of the metrics? Is your business going to show well? Or are you losing value because you're coming off a tough year? I mean, I'd argue that there are a lot of businesses that came out of COVID really thinking about whether the timing was right to sell, given that COVID took a big toll on a lot of businesses and their financial results and their operating results. So I think this also, the question of the business being ready, in addition to how it's performing, it also gets to the question of due diligence. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on due diligence later in the conversation. But due diligence, you should expect that the buyer is going to need to know a lot about your business in order to manage their risk and conversely to make an offer that reflects the true value of the business. It's maybe a long way of saying that you want to be as prepared as possible for due diligence going into that piece of the process. And think about it this way. If you do not have the due diligence materials ready, that can have an impact on the sale process. And it actually can make some buyers walk away. So again, I think the two key elements when you think about whether the business is ready, are there issues you need to address? Are there gaps you need to fill? Are there operating elements that you want to try and improve before you market the business? Are you making it as attractive as possible? And then are you making it as easy as possible from the standpoint of preparation? Have you prepared the materials and the information that a buyer is going to need to evaluate in order to make a good informed decision and ideally get you the best price? So again, we'll come back to that a little bit later, but that's a key concept. Now, if you are ready and the business is ready, how do you know if the market is ready? I can tell you with some level of certainty that timing the market is a near impossibility. If it were not, I would not be having this conversation. I would be on a beach at the moment, sipping a Mai Tai and enjoying a much different life than I do here in my beautiful home office with my daughter's artwork on the door. So remember that deals get done in the best markets, in the most difficult markets, and everywhere in between. Now, yes, there may be times that are better than others for sellers. For example, if we're in a deep recession, there may be fewer buyers in the marketplace actively looking for companies to buy. Capital may be tougher to come by. So in a recessionary environment, if you have the ability to weather the storm and wait it out, yeah, you might prefer to sell when the market backdrop is somewhat better, where there's earnings growth, there's strong job creation, interest rates are attractive. But if you remember, the deal process itself doesn't happen overnight. It can take months, if not years. I mean, I'd say on average, a typical transaction usually takes somewhere between 6 and 9 months just for the transaction process. It can be a little shorter in some cases. It can certainly be longer. And you also need time to prepare before the deal process itself. So I'd suggest go out and pull out that crystal ball and tell me what the market environment might look like in 6 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years. And that's certainly not easy to do. So my advice is that you should get ready, assuming that the market environment will be receptive. So what happens if it's not? Well, you got ready, and now you're ready for when the market environment is receptive. So I suggest get ready, stay ready, and wait for your window if you can. Now, if you can't, there still are opportunities to sell even when the market isn't great. There were a lot of deals that happened during the COVID environment. You might get a reduced price, that's for sure, it's possible. Or the buyer might place more emphasis on structuring the deal to protect against promises made. So I think about this from the standpoint of really trying to understand the likelihood of good future results. And what you see as a seller is that buyers will often structure a deal in terms of money paid up front versus money paid in the future or money paid contingently. So I colloquially will think of that as cash today, cash later, or cash if. And cash today, the price paid at closing is really the only guaranteed money you're going to get. And in a tough market, that might be the smallest piece of the puzzle, or it might be a smaller piece of the puzzle. When the market conditions aren't great, the buyer may place more emphasis on trying to protect their own investment by thinking about paying for future results when and if the future results are achieved. And they may hold back more of the consideration to protect against unknown elements that they couldn't see in due diligence or that were unexpected or difficult to predict. So think of it as kind of like the buyer is going to say as they review the business in detail, I want to believe you, but I don't. So I'm going to set up the deal structure so that if you're right and the business is a huge winner, I'll pay you more later once I'm sure. And this is very common, not at all something that you should be surprised at. But obviously, the more prepared you are, the better the market environment, the more emphasis there will be on the cash at closing or the cash today. So the good news is that buyer skepticism about the business can actually lead to upside for you as the seller, but generally only if you've got the business set up for future success. Buyers generally don't pay sellers for what the buyer will do to improve the business in the future. So the point is, don't fear if you hear terms like earnout or rollover equity or seller financing or things of that nature. This is just a way for the buyer to transfer some of the risk of owning the business back to the seller for some amount of time. And on this slide, you can see what happens, what it looks like when only 2 of the 3 factors are lined up. So if you and the business are ready, but the market is not, well, the backdrop may not be ideal, and you fall into this category in the top between the two upper circles. When you and the market are ready, but the business needs some work, you're going to see that there are operational improvements that you can consider making to make the business more attractive to the buyer. And then when the market and the business are ready, so the market backdrop is good, there's available capital, there are interested buyers, and the business is operating at full capacity and doing well, being successful, but you haven't thought about your next chapter, you might be in the category where you're doing some soul searching. And in my mind, that's the most difficult area to be, because if you're not a willing seller, that will reflect in the conversations you have as the buyer starts to do their due diligence. So I think the key is to make sure that you are committed to the sale. And we're going to spend some time on that a little bit later as well. What are your reasons for selling? Are you truly ready? Have you thought about all of the big picture items you need to consider as a potential seller, and are you ready? So moving on to the next concept, the $1 million, or perhaps for some of you, the multi-million-dollar question is, what is my business worth? And here's where I get a little bit controversial. I usually tend to advise clients to start thinking about valuation from the standpoint of their target price. What is your target price? What is it? What is the level where you are a willing seller, where you're interested in having a conversation with a buyer? And it can be different for everyone. The timing of that might be a little bit different, which I'll walk through in a moment. But I think the target price, generally speaking, needs to not be emotional. Now, the target price is not the valuation, so let's be clear on that. The target price is what the business owner wants to take away from the business in an ideal situation. It might be what the business is worth today. It might be what the business will be worth at some point in the future, or it might be what the business is worth once various operational elements are improved. Your profit margins are improved, your growth increases, your expansion into new markets is underway. So in any case, your objective as a business owner is to work on building and developing your business so that your target price matches up with what the market is willing to pay for a business like yours. So I don't have a silver bullet. You do hear often that valuation is called some combination of art and science. And over my 25-year career, I certainly believe that is likely true. If you ask industry experts about valuation, you'll probably get a number of different answers. Some will be somewhat theoretical. They'll focus on models or things like whatever the DCF suggests is going to be the valuation, or the comparables generally sell for 2.5 times EBITDA based on 20 relevant deals. And these types of approaches are good and common, but they generally need some market context. So if your business is the fastest growing car company in the marketplace, or is higher margin than all the competitors, you might get a higher price than the average selling multiple. But conversely, what happens when you're a successful restaurant just about to sell your business and tomorrow COVID hits? Things change quite meaningfully in a short period of time in some cases. So being able to kind of put that market context in is very important. So this gets to my controversial view of valuation. Again, you can look at the theoretical models and have people write you reports. There's any number of firms out there that can generate a valuation report that will tell you your business is worth X millions of dollars. And I won't say that they're wrong, but they may also not be right. And the reason that they might not be right is because that number that the report spits out is generally only the valuation if someone will pay the price. So let me say that a little bit differently. The price of the business, the valuation of the business, is what a buyer will pay to acquire the business. Full stop. So you can get a better understanding of what the price is by using the valuation frameworks appropriately. So what we're talking about in terms of a discounted cash flow analysis or comps, those are good guidelines to generating a view of valuation. And I certainly encourage business owners to use them either directly yourself. There are models out there that you can download and populate and play with to get a sense of what valuation should be. Or you can hire someone like an investment banker or a broker or transaction advisors of various sorts to help you with that. Or your CFO or your financial person can do this as well. And it should give you a sense of generally directionally where the valuation will lie. But you still need that market context of how does my business compare? And am I looking at a business that is more or less valuable than the general business that I would see in these various models? So when you're thinking about your target price and market value, you generally need to figure out, are these concepts in balance? Because if they are, then it's a good time to really think about undertaking a transaction process. If they're not, if they're out of balance, if the target price is too high, what are you going to need to do to actually achieve the market value? In that case, I think you're looking at a couple of different areas of focus. Operational improvements. Now, again, these can take time. So you may be thinking about it from the standpoint of how much time do I need to invest to improve the business to be more valuable in the eyes of buyers? Or if I don't have that time, do I need to reset my expectations? Do I need to think about my target price as maybe artificially inflated? Do I need to think about it differently? Or do I need to rethink timing? Is it that the market isn't ready to pay the price now, but over time, as I grow and generally scale the business in an organic or even an inorganic way, will I achieve that market value that matches my target price 2, 3, 4 years from now? And what steps will I have to take?
Yeah. Hey, Phil, this is Cliff. We got a question from the floor here,
Yep.
and it's a pretty good one, and it relates right to what you're talking about. How do you estimate a value for a company that is ready to go to market? It has customers lined up, but there is no revenue yet. It's in the pre-revenue stage. Maybe it has a tech product or something that's been developed, but you don't know. You can't predict what the future, you can't project what future revenues are going to be. How do you value a company like that?
So first, it's a great question, and it's one that I've actually faced. So I'm going to walk through an example on a no-names basis for a company I worked with roughly 2 years ago that was almost in that exact situation. Again, valuation being somewhat combination of art and science. When you don't have hard numbers to work from, then the art component tends to take an inflated portion of the pie. And I think what's important is to focus on the metrics that you're putting in place as you look at your valuation, your assumptions and the elements that you're building into the model. How well rooted are they in logic? How confident are you that someone will hear your approach and say, that makes sense? So to go through the example, I was working with a company that was a consumer safety device manufacturer, and they were at the point where their beta test was successful and they were ready to produce market units. And the challenge they had was there was a 6 or 7 person team, and they didn't have operational infrastructure to actually build the devices and bring them to market, marketing team, et cetera. And they wanted to take a small investment to find the resources to bring the product to market. And ultimately, they found a buyer that was willing to invest about 20% of the total value of the company to give them the resources, both by shared resources internally, so that the buyer would offer their factory floor, but also capital to buy the components and build up the working capital and do some marketing. When we were trying to establish what the value was and what it should be, obviously we didn't have revenue that we could point to. We didn't have profit that we could point to. It was 100% negative profit, right? The company was simply bleeding cash, and there was no clear end to that. But what we did do is we said, when this business gets up and running, what do we think it'll actually achieve? And we looked at specifically the market size for this particular consumer safety device. And we put together an analysis that said there are this many devices sold in a given year. And we believe that market will expand if we change the technology to our product by this much. We said maybe it'll grow 50% more. And therefore, the average revenue in the market for everyone to take looked like X, Y, Z. And then we said, well, what, as a small company, what's likely for us to achieve? And we took our estimated market share, our penetration rate, and built out our revenue case, trying to show the buyer that we thought the market opportunity for us as a company was going to look like a certain size of business. And based on the future expectations of markets, again, now we're going to discount not a cash flow, but we're doing a discounted revenue approach. What did that look like in today's dollars? So how patient do I have to be to reach that? And then we risk adjusted it. So we took an approach that said, we don't have a traditional way of looking at this that people would usually see, but we have something that we can make some estimations on. And effectively what happened, the process was that the investor or the buyer worked with us to fine tune those estimates. And they said, we think the market actually is 50 billion, not 40 billion. But we also think your penetration rate is probably going to be 3%, not 5%. So we came to an agreement by negotiating and discussing what we thought the market opportunity looked like and what it was worth to all the participants in this discussion. So the buyer, obviously, what will they get as the owner of the technology, the owner of this company, and what will the company get in terms of being able to capture market share. What does their revenue profile look like? And that was kind of a unique approach, but it was one that took some creativity. So again, that art component of the art and science. There's a million different ways you can look at valuation for a company that's pre-revenue. And this was something that happened a lot in the early 2000s in the dot-com era. The traditional metrics didn't work for the models at play. So you have to think about, if the traditional metrics don't work, what else could I use? And is it realistic? Is it logical? Does it pass the smell test? So a little bit case by case specific for different situations. But I think the point is there are ways to do this, and you work with your advisors or your trusted individuals that are spending time with you to help come up with a framework that might be at least negotiable. So I think at that point, let me continue on. If there are other questions, Cliff, definitely feel free to interrupt me. I don't need to keep hearing my own voice. I'm certainly happy to engage where it makes sense. But continuing on, what's my business worth? I think the other thing to think about is, with an average business, an average multiple is for an average business. So when you think about the art and science, you need to compare yourself to the other participants in the market. And how much emphasis would a buyer place on the various factors that you're looking at? So if you're a faster growing business or a tech company, will a buyer actually provide a higher valuation because you're in a market that has higher potential? Or is cash flow and profit the most important consideration? How do you match up with both the metrics that an average deal looks like, but also what the buyer has the most interest in? So again, I think it's important to remove emotion and be as practical as you can. And if you have a target price, which you absolutely should, is the market likely to pay that target price? And if not, what are you going to do to match those things up? And that's how you think about valuation from a more practical standpoint. Again, controversial view, so I'll take the heat for not having the traditional view that the DCF is the answer or the comps tell the story. But I do think it does help sellers to think about it from a more of the standpoint of, there are more parties in this conversation than just yourself and your team. The buyer will actually think about what they think valuation is too. So shifting gears, thinking about the buyers. Again, there are two parties in every conversation around a transaction. There's the buyer and the seller. So as the seller, how do you figure out who is the right buyer? In the past, and probably for a lot of people even on the conversation here today, the right buyer is generally going to be the one who pays the price that you want, or pays the highest price in a more colloquial way of explaining it. But increasingly what we are seeing in the industry is that more and more business owners are giving consideration to elements beyond just the purchase price. And they're thinking about things like their legacy, the stakeholders of the business, and that's the employees, the customers, the partners, the suppliers, the entire ecosystem. The succession plan of the business. And these things are a little bit harder to quantify. So how do you find a buyer who's right based on what you prioritize, what matters to you and your business? Now, what I've done here on this slide is listed out a couple of different categories of buyers. We talked about this a moment ago as we were starting the conversation. The blue bubbles represent what I call outsiders or third parties, competitors, customers, partners, suppliers. These are external parties who are in your industry, or in some cases are not in your industry. It could simply be an operating company that wants to go from a certain portion of the market to a more vertically or horizontally integrated business model. We can talk about the rules of engagement here, but in some cases, you're going to want to be a little bit careful about how you speak to any of them if you approach or if they approach. In a lot of cases, the information that you might share might be a little sensitive. So having the right level of confidentiality and protecting some of the more sensitive data about your business until the right point is very important with the parties that are outside your business, the competitors, the customers, the partner suppliers, or simply other operating businesses. The gray bubble, family or friends. These are people you know. Then there may be some qualitative factors at play if you're engaging with them as a potential buyer. This is very common in a family business where the parents transition ownership to the sons and daughters or the cousins or other members of the family. And there may be a situation in those scenarios where you might be willing to structure a longer term arrangement where necessary. So for example, if the children lack the capital to acquire the business, you may structure something where future profits are used to pay down the ownership stake. And there are lots of ways to think about that as well. Point is, those conversations can be a little bit different because you're generally working with folks that you have some personal connection with, which changes the dynamics of the conversations. And in orange, we have the financial buyers. These are typically private equity or investors that are called family offices. They generally manage large pools of money for wealthy individuals or for groups of investors, and they buy businesses professionally. They buy businesses typically as an investment. These folks generally don't let emotion guide them in decisions. It's generally deeply about the numbers and the position of the business in the market. But in contrast, these buyers can also be generally very efficient and discreet in pursuing deals because they know what they want, they know how to find it, and if it looks the right way, they move forward generally very quickly. So I think as you think about how to identify the right buyer amongst these groups, you should be thinking about what are your transaction priorities? What matters to you as the owner of the business? Where do you want to see the business go after you move on? Do you have family members who want to take over after you retire, after you walk away? Have you talked about a plan with them? Have you identified who might be the best to run the business going forward? Or are you thinking primarily about the third parties? And if you are, how do you balance confidentiality against the desire to have a real conversation, to understand what the buyer is willing to pay? Because it's hard for them to give a true view on valuation if they don't know enough about the business. Conversely, are there some folks you don't want to speak to? Are there some competitors where it's just too sensitive or the competition has been too intense of a rivalry where discussing potentially transitioning your business to them might be unpalatable? Who do you want to avoid? And you're, as a seller, you're allowed to have that approach. And then what I think is really important here, what do you know about these parties? The potential folks that you're going to put on your guest list, for lack of a better term, what have they done in the past? What deals have they done? What have they paid? What are the multiples or structures they've used for their past acquisitions? And maybe most importantly, have previous sellers been happy with the business's approach to acquisition? Was everyone feeling good about the deal afterwards? That may be a little tricky to find out early on, but certainly I think as you're going through a transaction process, don't forget that you're allowed to do due diligence on the buyer as well. Some of it will be desktop research or ground effort work, but in some cases you might actually be able to approach previous sellers and have a direct conversation. So moving on to due diligence, I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading all of these elements on this page, but I do think it's important to talk about due diligence because it is arguably the most challenging part of the process. You're in your discussions, you're talking about deal pricing and general terms are being thrown around, and people are feeling good about the situation, but you're going to need to let the buyer perform due diligence. They're really going to need to get deep in the weeds on your business. Now, why? What's the point? Well, for most buyers, it's about protecting against risk. The key thing to remember, and this is not the most obvious thing, for many buyers, they're not even spending their own money. They're probably spending somebody else's money. They're either borrowing from a bank, or in the case of a private equity firm, they have investments from third parties that make up their pool of capital. So since they're spending somebody else's money, they're probably going to do whatever they need to do to make sure that the investment is protected. And in some cases, they're even obligated to do this by regulators. So this is certainly something to bear in mind. If you think about the typical private equity firm, if they have a track record of not getting their money back, if they're not doing well in terms of their investments performing, generally speaking, at some point, the investor is going to stop giving them money to invest. So it really is important for them to do their due diligence early so they know everything they can about the business to protect against that risk of something going wrong, either something that they could have known about, they should have known about, or something unexpected that should have been on the horizon or at least in their thought process. So they will need to know as much as possible about the business, how it runs, the products, the financials, the market, the people, the intellectual property, the competitors, the team structure, basically everything there is to know. And it certainly sounds like a lot, and it is. if you've never been through it before, it can be arduous. There's a lot of questions, meetings, requests for information, discussions about things that are kind of the minutia of the business. So as a business owner, if you're trying to run a due diligence process on the fly without preparing in advance, it can take a lot of time and it can be very distracting because it's kind of like a full-time job for a lot of folks, and you're still trying to run your business. So, every situation is different, and some businesses will have more or less information. Obviously, a single location retail shop is very different from a $10 million manufacturing firm. But this checklist on this slide should give you a rough sense of where buyers would like to spend their due diligence time and the effort to learn about your business. Now, this generally takes place primarily after there's a fairly firm offer in place, because so much of the information that they're going to request is going to be sensitive. And it is pretty thorough. So you don't want to wait to start on preparing for due diligence. My recommendation, and I'm sure Cliff shares this view, is that if you are thinking about selling your business, you should always be thinking about organizing your due diligence info proactively and whenever you can.
Okay. And by the way, this is a perfect time for me to jump in.
Please.
Phil, you've been doing an absolutely great job here, but also too, I think this is very real how you and I are working together, because usually as a lawyer, I don't get involved in transactions like this until the deal has kind of come together and we've started, with the due diligence process and the letter of intent and all of that. That's when your lawyer, your accountant is going to get involved. But I want to underscore something that Phil said, because I share his view of this. The best time to do diligence on your business is before you put the business up for sale. Don't wait for the buyer to get involved and start asking all kinds of embarrassing questions. When a buyer does due diligence, that's when you find out all the things you did wrong in doing the business, and not just on the legal side, but this is when you find out that you haven't been having minutes of your board meetings the way you should have. That somebody that helped you develop your product didn't sign an assignment of rights agreement, so they technically own a piece of your technology legally. They own the copyright to it. You don't want that to come up in the course of the buyer's due diligence. The best time to do it is I always ask clients, when a client says that they want to sell their business, get your lawyer, your accountant involved as soon as possible, so that we can look into this stuff and clean up as many of the messes as possible, or at least come up with explanations that will satisfy, the buyer's team, the buyer's lawyer, the buyer's accountant. They're going to have professionals advising them too, and they are going to be ruthless in looking at, for problems and for holes. So just to underscore what you said there, Phil.
I think that's great, Cliff, and I think you've emphasized exactly the right point. There are two things buyers hate more than anything. They hate surprises. So doing that due diligence on yourself, getting that information together, predicting the questions that are coming, and having answers ready is a very critical process. Not everybody does it, but I think everyone who does do it certainly sees benefit. But buyers are also impatient. If they're working with a business on a potential deal and the information isn't there and it's going to take time to put it together and their questions are lagging, they might move on to the next deal. They might move on to somebody else who is more prepared. And I think that also brings forth, I'm going to wrap up this conversation quickly because I know we're starting to get a little bit low on time, but why do you need to do this proactively in advance? Why does it matter? Why can't you just wait? Sure, I said surprises and patience are key elements that buyers think about, but what happens if a buyer knocks on your door tomorrow? What if the Cinderella situation happens and Prince Charming is standing outside looking for his bride-to-be, and he's identified your business as that partner? Are you ready to have a serious discussion? Will you be ready to move ahead if their offer is attractive? Or are you going to risk them moving on to something else? Are you going to risk the conversation taking too long? And by being as prepared as possible on the due diligence side, one, you avoid surprises. Two, you keep the buyer interested. And three, you're ready to go quickly if someone shows up. Now, that's a rare scenario, but I have seen it numerous times. And especially since I started my consulting firm, so many of the businesses I've worked with, they started with the plan of, let's put the due diligence information together, let's organize it, let's be ready. I want to sell in 3 years. Unexpectedly, a buyer approached them. It's happened 5 times since I started Amplify in 2021. It's definitely something that does happen. And if you're prepared for it, you're in a better place to move quickly and not get distracted if the deal isn't there, or to capitalize on it if the deal is there.
Okay. We had an interesting question from the floor here, Phil. One of the key due diligence elements for a business like mine is source code. Is obviously a software developer, SaaS developer. Will a standard NDA be sufficient, or is more protection needed? Also, how to handle the timing. Well, let me sort of address this.
Yeah.
You should always, the minute you start dealing with a buyer, and before you give them any information of any kind whatsoever, you should have a standard NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, in place with that buyer. Don't give them anything until you have it. These are fairly standardized documents. You know, your attorney, I mean, I have over 100 different forms of NDA for just about any kind of business. It's not going to be a huge bill. It only takes me a few minutes to bang these things out. You know, get that protection in writing. Otherwise, because if you don't have one of these in place, you don't have the legal right to sue them if they rip you off. Now, as far as source code is concerned, however, I do a lot of software deals for my clients. I have a lot of clients who are SaaS developers. You should never ever show the source code to the buyer until the closing takes place. That's rule number one. You never get into the weeds there. You can certainly give them an overview. You can give them flow charts. You can give them whatever to show how everything is put together. Usually in a tech sale, they will the key development people will go over to the buyer as part of the deal. It will be an acqui-hire, so they can get all the tech support that they need after the closing from those people. But the minute you give away your source code, I mean, you've really given away the keys to the kingdom at that point. And if the buyer is not a good person, you are opening yourself up to some potential problems with them stealing the business, especially if the buyer is a competitor and is in the same space. I mean, I did a deal a couple of years ago where a client of mine sold out to a competitor, and within 30 days, the business was basically shut down after the closing. What the buyer really wanted was my client's people. They really didn't want my client's product. They were looking to put a competitor out of business. Now, my client came away with a great deal. I'm not going to say that. They got a very, very useful purchase, a very nice purchase price, a nice reward for all the years that they spent putting the deal together. But, you know, if one of your goals is to create a legacy for future generations, you know, selling to a competitor is probably not a very good idea. So anyway, a little bit of rambling there. Phil, back to you.
So if you're spot on with this, I would never trust anyone with my trade secrets until I'm certain that they are about to pay me for those trade secrets. No matter how strong the NDA is, no matter how strong you think you have confidence in the buyer's intentions, never believe it at the expense of your secret sauce. So there are ways, if a buyer has a deep desire to see the source code and it's contingent for them to close the deal, there are ways to address that. Lock boxes or clean rooms or things that allow for kind of one-off review and limiting the number of people involved, et cetera. But I would never trust anyone to hold my source code or to review it real time without some level of confidence that the deal is going through, because it's all you got. So there, why don't we just move on to getting professional help, because I think this is important, and hopefully Cliff will appreciate the fact that I put lawyers first in the top left of this page, because I believe every deal needs a lawyer. And then I'll stop there and move back to the other folks before turning over to Cliff to explain why every deal needs a lawyer. It's not self-serving for him. It is true. You should never try to be your own lawyer when negotiating a purchase agreement. It is an exercise doomed to fail. As it relates to other folks that can help you, accountants, most businesses have some form of accounting in place. Not all businesses use professional accountants. It certainly can help if you have an external accountant or you can afford one. They don't necessarily have to do an audit or even a formal review of the numbers, but certainly some level of confidence that a professional accountant has looked at or has compiled the numbers can provide some level of confidence to buyers that there are certain approaches that have been followed, guidelines and ways of doing things in the most proper manners that are in place here. Is it worth hiring one just for a transaction? Yeah, that may be a discussion that I would hold offline. But you know, I certainly think that there are levels of confidence you get, and it depends on the size and state of your business, some of the circumstances that are relevant to you. bankers and brokers are an interesting one. I think there's generally a good argument for a banker or a broker. The major distinction, bankers tend to be FINRA registered broker dealers generally. Brokers tend to be smaller. They may or may not be FINRA registered. But the point is, bankers work on larger deals for the most part. Brokers tend to work on smaller deals. And they are deal experts. They're experts in negotiations and organizing, the marketing of the opportunity to multiple buyers. And when you generally might want one is when you're going to approach a moderate or large number of potential buyers. They'll organize the process for you. They'll keep it streamlined. They'll keep the conversations kind of organized. They'll make it easy for you because this is their job. They do it every day. You certainly want to have a banker or a broker that knows your industry and knows the buyers, knows the marketplace, and ideally can actually open some doors that maybe you can't on your own. So maybe they know some folks that you haven't thought of, or they have access to people that you have thought of and you just don't know them directly. But I certainly think fees are an important consideration here. The bankers and brokers can take a meaningful amount of the deal proceeds. So just be careful that you know what you're agreeing to when you sign the purchase contract. And the second thing I would say is if you are approached by a buyer directly, this may be a time when you might not need a banker or a broker. If you're having a productive, constructive conversation, involving a banker can help with fine-tuning the negotiations, but it may not be critical at that phase, depending on, again, the circumstances of the deal. Who else can you involve? Absolutely, just like a lawyer, you should have a tax advisor, a tax attorney, someone who can help you manage the tax elements, because this is where you will lose money as a seller. If there's anything I can say, the best tax advice is to have a tax attorney or a tax advisor early and often before you decide to sell. Same with a financial advisor. What will you do with the proceeds once you receive the money? Making a plan for your future is very critical. And then the self-serving piece, there are folks like myself who help around the edges. You don't always need these. I wouldn't say these are required in every transaction. But again, the point here is that there is professional help out there if you are going through the process, probably for the first time, maybe for the only time. It's not a situation where I highly recommend learning on the job. So, see what works for you and make your choices there. But
Good.
again, Cliff should talk about why
Phil,
lawyers are great.
actually, Phil, just go back to your previous slide for a second. I noticed where do you fit in all of this? Now, you're a consultant in terms of these transactions. Obviously, you're not a lawyer, you're not a CPA, you're not going to do any of that kind of stuff. But where do you fit into this process? What do you do for a client that is looking to sell their business?
So I would call myself a transaction prep consultant, and I can help people from the day they start thinking about what they want to do with their business to the day they actually close and everywhere in between. I'm not a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant. I just play one on TV. So I can help on some of the low-level stuff on, for example, I know a lot of the deal terms that people might want to see in an NDA and what buyers might reject. I'm not going to negotiate the legal language necessarily, but can I help you think about, hey, the buyer's going to push back on this. We should think about what our approach is going to be. Sure. Getting a good presentation together, coming up with that list of buyers and researching them, thinking about what the due diligence process is going to look like, anticipating questions, helping make sure the financial model has some level of scrutiny on it. Basically, everywhere where you might want some help being ready is where I play. And that's because over my 25 years, I found a lot of guys who were going through it for the first time. They often had questions and wanted to have access to someone who'd seen it a few times before, but they weren't ready to formally hire a bank. And the banks don't like to get involved until there's a deal because their fees tend to be contingent. So there's not often a lot of resources available until you decide you're really ready to go. So I try to fill that gap where you want some advice around the edges, where you want some project work done to think about specific elements of preparation, and I'm a bit of an ear. I tend to help people think about questions, where they might find some value in the process. And again, I've done it for 25 years. I've seen a lot of crazy things. I probably have not seen anywhere near as many as other folks. But the point is, I do it every day, and I try to help in terms of anticipating things that'll come up.
Okay, that's great. Could you advance the slide, please, Phil? Okay. First of all, we've only got a few minutes left. The focus on this program really is, before you put your business up for sale, what should you be considering? Obviously, we're not going to have a whole lot of time to talk about the actual sale process. You should be aware I do have a 1 hour video on YouTube on this topic specifically. What do you do when you have a buyer? What's the process? Letter of intent, contract of sale, closing. If you go to youtube.com and search for Cliff Ennico Selling Your Business, I always go by Cliff, never Clifford. You'll probably get right to the 1 hour video. It was a SCORE presentation that I gave a couple of years ago for SCORE Fairfield County that will walk you through, the step by step what's involved when you're selling a business at that stage. I just want to underscore a few things. I thought, Bill, you did a wonderful job of talking about this. Just from my own personal perspective, these are just some things that I talk about. I mean, I do get calls from clients who are at the pre-sale stage and want to know what they should be doing. These are just some of my thoughts on the right reasons and the wrong reasons to sell the business. You know, the COVID-19 thing was very interesting. 2020 and 2021 were actually two of my busiest years in terms of M&A deals. I think I did about 24 deals in over that period of time. COVID-19, while it did hit a lot of businesses hard financially, it didn't really stop the deal flow at all. A lot of businesses sold, and a lot of them were actually sold based on pre-COVID numbers. So don't be put off by something like that. I mean, certainly a buyer is going to want to know how your business was impacted by COVID. But if there's a compelling case that COVID was just a temporary hit, you can still find a buyer. And I think Phil made that point very well. Next slide, Phil. If you would, and I think that's the last, whoops, here we go. Here are some of the big questions that you really want to ask yourself. You need both a lawyer and an accountant, by the way. You should always have two advisors. We tend to look at different things. The accountants tend to be involved more in financial due diligence. The lawyers tend to be more involved in the contracts. Here's something I will share with you is when I'm doing a deal for a client who's selling a business, I don't worry about the seller. I don't worry about the buyer. I mean, both sides are motivated to get the deal done. And as long as they communicate well, whatever hiccups or speed bumps we hit along the way, we can find a way to resolve them or work around them. What I will focus on and what I worry about is third parties over whom the business, we have no control in the process. Are there any third parties out there that have to consent to the sale of the business, and will they play ball in a situation like this? So for example, lenders, if your business did an EIDL loan with the SBA during COVID, you will have to pay that sucker back. And you can negotiate a write down with the SBA, but it takes months to get approval, and time kills deals. As Phil accurately pointed out, it's one of the oldest sayings in this business: time kills deals. The longer you have delay, the less likely. It's human nature. The more time people have to think about whether they want to buy something, they tend to talk themselves out of it. They don't talk themselves into the buying decision. It's just human nature. The landlords are a key third party, and they're all over the place. There are some landlords that are, commercial real estate firms. They're very professional. It's just a business decision to them. And then you have mom and pop landlords who are living in Florida. They've been getting paid every month for the last, umpty years, and now all of a sudden they're being asked to accept a total stranger. They're not sure if they're going to have enough money to live on. I will tell you that whenever I have had a deal fall apart or crater over the last several years, it's almost always the landlords that do it, that kill the deal. So always make sure that you get find out who those third parties are: lenders, franchisors, if you're a franchise business, key developers, a key employee, who understands everything about the technology. And if he doesn't go over to the buyer, the thing's not going to work. Who are these people, and how are you going to make them happy as part of the process? That's probably one of the key decisions. Next slide, Phil, which is really the last slide here. Okay, we are basically at the end of our hour. We've tried to answer as many questions as possible. This is how you can reach each of us. All of our contact information. And by the way, another thing you may want to consider, if you are not currently a SCORE client, I would strongly advise you to get a score counselor involved, because they tend to get a little bit more involved in the in understanding your business, how you work. They really, how can I say it? They're a combination of business advisor, shrink, and mommy. It's probably the best way to put it, and they could be a key player too in helping you, make some of these, difficult personal decisions about whether or not it's the right time to sell. So with that, Phil, I see that we're exactly at 1 o'clock here.
Right.
There is one more. There is one more slide, but it's one more for Bob Hogan than for either of
Well,
us, and that is, I've just given Score an incredible pitch, Bob.
that's right.
But
Thank you.
why don't you take it from there?
Well, thank you very much. And we are unfortunately out of time, but I think we covered all of the questions that came in as we went along. And Phil kindly answered a couple in the chat while you were speaking. So just as a reminder to everyone, there is a recording of this webinar. We've had some questions along the way, and the materials will be likely available later today, or if not tomorrow morning, on our website under on-demand webinars. And those who registered will be sent a link to those. Again, if you want to take advantage of the free individual counseling that Cliff so kindly mentioned, all you have to do is use that link there or go to our website and just request a mentor. And on behalf of SCORE, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's live webinar. And particularly big thank you to Phil and Cliff for presenting today. Lots of valuable information there, and appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Cliff.
Thanks, everyone.
Always a pleasure, and Phil, great job today.
Likewise, Cliff, and thank you to you and Bob.